What happens when grief transforms into madness and desperation becomes a weapon more dangerous than any blade? In a house where sunlight never entered and hope had long since died, 3 women shared more than sorrow. They shared a man whose refusal to commit one final unspeakable act would unleash a horror that would leave only one alive to confess the truth. If stories of human darkness and redemption captivate you, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about the depths of human desperation. The Whitmore plantation house stood like a monument to grief in the heart of Georgia, its windows sealed shut with heavy curtains that hadn't been drawn in over a decade. No sunlight had touched those rooms since 1847, the year the last husband died, leaving behind 3 sisters, bound not by blood, but by a shared curse that had consumed their very souls. Margaret Whitmore, at 45, was the eldest and the most dangerous. Her steel-grey hair was always pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her pale skin across sharp cheekbones, and her dark eyes held the fervor of a woman who had made peace with damnation long ago. She moved through the house like a general, commanding a war against fate itself. Every step calculated, every word measured for maximum impact on those around her. "The Lord tests those he loves most," she would whisper to herself each morning as she stared into the cracked mirror in her bedroom, her reflection fragmented like her sanity. And we have been tested beyond measure. Catherine, 37, had once been considered the beauty of the 3. Her auburn hair still held traces of its former luster, though it now hung limp around a face that had grown gaunt from years of sleepless nights and endless worry. She was the follower, the one who nodded when Margaret spoke, who carried out orders without question, not from loyalty, but from a bone-deep fear of confrontation that had been beaten into her by years of disappointment. "Yes, Margaret," had become her most common phrase, spoken in a voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter what little peace existed in their cursed household. And then there was Eleanor, the youngest at 33, who still clung to hope like a drowning woman clutches driftwood. Her blonde hair was often disheveled from nervous habits, running her fingers through it when anxiety overwhelmed her, which was nearly constant. She was the one who still prayed, who still believed that somewhere in the darkness of their situation, salvation might be found. "Perhaps this time," she would murmur to herself, "perhaps this time it will work." The 3 women had each been married, each had buried a husband, and each had failed in the one duty that 19th century society demanded of them above all others, bearing children. Margaret's husband had died of consumption after 7 barren years. Catherine's had succumbed to a heart attack after 5 years of trying. Eleanor's had been thrown from a horse after only 3 years of marriage, but even in that short time her womb had remained empty. The townspeople whispered that the Whitmore women were cursed, that something in their bloodline prevented them from carrying life. The sisters had heard these whispers, had felt the pitying stares and the subtle exclusion from social gatherings where other women spoke of their children's accomplishments and growing families. But the sisters knew something the townspeople didn't. They weren't related by blood. Margaret had been born a Whitmore, inheriting the plantation from her father. Catherine had married into the name when she wed Margaret's cousin. Eleanor had taken the name when she married Catherine's brother-in-law. They were bound together not by family ties, but by the shared weight of their failures and the desperate belief that together they might find a way to break the curse that seemed to follow the Whitmore name. In the center of their obsession stood Samuel, a man of 32 whose dark skin bore the scars of both physical labor and psychological torment. He had been purchased by Margaret's late husband 15 years earlier, a young man full of strength and defiance that had been systematically broken down over the years. Samuel was tall and broad-shouldered, with intelligent eyes that had learned to hide their thoughts behind a mask of compliance. But Samuel was more than just another enslaved person on the plantation. He had become the focal point of the sisters' shared delusion. They had convinced themselves that through him, through rituals and ceremonies that grew more disturbing with each passing month, they could manipulate the very forces of nature to grant them what they desired most. "He is our instrument," Margaret would say during their nightly gatherings in the parlor, her voice taking on the cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon. "Through him, we will find our redemption. The rituals had started small, making Samuel perform specific tasks at certain times of day, forcing him to handle objects they believed held mystical significance, requiring him to repeat phrases in languages none of them understood but had found in books they'd acquired from traveling merchants who dealt in the occult. As months turned to years, the demands became more invasive, more humiliating. They made him sleep in different rooms of the house depending on the phase of the moon. They forced him to fast for days at a time, believing his hunger would somehow transfer to their wombs as a craving for life. They made him tend a garden where they grew herbs and plants they believed held fertility powers, requiring him to water them with his own blood drawn from small cuts they inflicted on his arms. Samuel endured it all, with the stoic resignation of a man who understood that resistance would only bring greater suffering. He had learned long ago that survival meant compliance, that showing defiance would result in punishments that could leave him unable to work, and an enslaved person who couldn't work was a dead enslaved person. But in the quiet moments when the sisters were occupied with their planning and plotting, Samuel would look out through the cracks in the boarded windows and remember what freedom felt like. He remembered his childhood before he was captured, remembered his mother's laugh and his father's strong hands teaching him to carve wood. He remembered a time when he was Samuel the person, not Samuel the instrument. The house itself seemed to reflect the madness of its inhabitants. Rooms that had once hosted elegant dinner parties now served as storage for the sisters' growing collection of mystical artifacts. The dining room table was covered with candles, crystals, dried herbs, and books, filled with symbols and incantations. The walls were lined with mirrors that Margaret insisted would multiply the power of our intentions. The kitchen, once the heart of a bustling household, had been transformed into something resembling an alchemist's laboratory. Pots bubbled with strange concoctions, and the air was thick with the smoke of burning herbs. The sisters took turns preparing these mixtures, each convinced that the right combination of ingredients would unlock the secret to fertility. As winter approached in 1857, the sisters' desperation reached new heights. They had been living in their self-imposed isolation for 10 years, and their obsession had only grown stronger with time. The outside world had moved on. The country was heading towards civil war. Society was changing. But inside the Whitmore house, time had stopped. "We are running out of time," Margaret announced one evening as the three sisters sat in their parlor, the room lit only by dozens of candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "I can feel it in my bones. If we don't act soon, we will lose our chance forever." Catherine nodded automatically, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had stopped thinking for herself years ago, finding it easier to simply agree with whatever Margaret decided. Eleanor, however, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. "What are you suggesting, Margaret?" Margaret's eyes gleamed in the candlelight, and when she smiled, it was the expression of a woman who had crossed a line from which there was no return. "I've been reading, studying, consulting with those who understand the deeper mysteries. There is one ritual, one final ceremony that could grant us what we seek." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over her sisters like a shroud. "But it requires a sacrifice that we have never been willing to make before." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the candles and the distant sound of Samuel moving about in the kitchen, preparing their evening meal as he had done every night for the past 10 years. "What kind of sacrifice?" Eleanor whispered, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Innocence. Pure, untainted innocence. The kind that can only be found in those who have just entered this world." Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and horrible understanding. "You're talking about children," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "Not harming them," Margaret said quickly, though her tone suggested she had considered that option as well. "Simply borrowing something from them, something they won't even miss." She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and its cover worn smooth by countless hands. "Hair," she said, opening the book to a page covered with symbols and diagrams. "A lock of hair from 3 newborn children, taken during the dark of the moon, combined with the blood of our instrument and the tears of our desperation. The ritual must be performed at the exact moment when the moon is completely hidden from view. Eleanor felt her stomach turn. Margaret, that's stealing. That's violating innocent families. Innocent families who have what we've been denied. Margaret's voice rose, her composure cracking for the first time in months. Innocent families who sleep peacefully at night while we suffer in darkness. Innocent families who take for granted the very thing we would die to possess. Catherine reached out and placed a trembling hand on Margaret's arm. Sister, perhaps we should think about this more carefully. Perhaps there's another way. But Margaret shook off her touch, her eyes blazing with fanatic fervor. There is no other way. I've tried everything else. We've tried everything else. This is our last chance, our only chance. She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and pressing her face against the heavy curtains, as if she could see through them to the world beyond. I know which families to target, she continued, her voice taking on a planning tone that was somehow more frightening than her earlier outburst. The Hendersons just had their third child last month. The Parkers welcomed twins in September, and the Crawfords. Their baby was born just 2 weeks ago. Eleanor felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Margaret, please, this isn't right. This isn't what God would want. Margaret whirled around, her face twisted with rage. God has abandoned us. God has cursed us with empty wombs and broken dreams. If God won't grant us what we need, then we'll take it ourselves. The room fell silent again, the weight of Margaret's blasphemy hanging in the air like smoke from their ritual fires. It was Catherine who finally spoke, her voice so quiet they had to strain to hear her. When would this happen? Margaret's smile returned, cold and calculating. The new moon is in 3 days. Samuel will go to each house in turn, take what we need and return before dawn. By the time the sun rises, we will have everything necessary to perform the ritual. Eleanor stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. I need some air, she said, though they all knew that the windows hadn't been opened in years. As she left the room, Margaret called after her. Think carefully about what you want, Eleanor. Think about whether you're willing to let this opportunity pass by because of misplaced moral concerns. Alone in the hallway, Eleanor pressed her back against the wall and tried to steady her breathing. She could hear Margaret and Catherine continuing their discussion in hushed tones, planning the details of their horrific scheme. For the first time in years, Eleanor found herself truly questioning what they had become. She thought about the women they had been before their husbands died, before their obsession consumed them. She remembered laughing, remembered feeling joy, remembered a time when the idea of violating innocent families would have been unthinkable. But she also remembered the crushing weight of disappointment, month after month when her courses came, the pitying looks from other women, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She remembered the desperate prayers, the bargains she had tried to make with God, the growing certainty that she was somehow fundamentally broken. As she stood in the dark hallway, Eleanor realized that she was at a crossroads. She could continue down the path Margaret was leading them on, deeper into darkness and moral corruption, or she could find the courage to say no. But saying no would mean accepting that she would never be a mother, never hold a child of her own, never experience the joy that seemed to come so easily to other women. The choice before her was between her soul and her deepest desire, and as she stood there in the shadows of the Whitmore house, Eleanor wasn't sure which one would win. Samuel had learned to read the moods of the Whitmore sisters, like a farmer reads the sky for signs of coming storms. Tonight, as he prepared their evening meal in the kitchen that had become his prison, he could feel the electricity of their excitement crackling through the house like lightning before thunder. He moved methodically through his tasks, slicing bread, ladling soup into bowls, arranging everything on the silver tray that had once served guests at elegant dinner parties. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. After 10 years of serving these women, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when their obsessions were about to take a darker turn. The kitchen bore little resemblance to what it had been when he first arrived at the plantation, where once there had been copper pots for cooking family meals. Now there were cauldrons for brewing the sisters' mystical concoctions. The walls, once lined with practical utensils, now held bundles of dried herbs. strange symbols carved into wooden plaques, and jars filled with liquids that Samuel preferred not to identify. He had been 17 when Margaret's husband purchased him from a slave trader in Savannah. Samuel still remembered that day with crystal clarity, the way the chains had chafed his wrists, the smell of fear and desperation that hung over the auction block, the cold calculation in the white men's eyes as they examined him like livestock. But he also remembered the moment when he first saw the Whitmore plantation, when he still believed that hard work and compliance might earn him a measure of dignity, perhaps even eventual freedom. He had been young enough then to hope, naive enough to believe that if he proved his worth, he might be treated with something approaching humanity. Those illusions had died slowly, painfully, over the years that followed. Margaret's husband had been a hard man, but a predictable one. He demanded long hours of labor, strict obedience, and absolute submission, but his cruelties were straightforward: the whip for disobedience, reduced rations for laziness, extra work for any sign of defiance. Samuel had learned to navigate those expectations, to survive within the brutal but comprehensible system of plantation slavery. But when the husband died and the sisters began their descent into obsession, Samuel found himself in a far more dangerous situation. Physical punishment he could endure. His body could heal from whippings, his strength could return after periods of starvation. But what the sisters demanded of him was something far more insidious. They wanted to break his spirit, to transform him from a human being into a mystical tool for their desperate purposes. The transformation had been gradual. At first, it had seemed almost benign. They asked him to perform certain tasks at specific times, to handle objects they claimed were sacred, to repeat words in languages he didn't understand. He had complied because resistance would have meant punishment, and because the request seemed harmless enough. But as months turned to years, the demands became more invasive, more humiliating, more designed to strip away his sense of self. They made him sleep in different rooms based on their mystical calculations, forced him to fast until he was weak with hunger, required him to participate in ceremonies that made his skin crawl with their perverse intimacy. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the way they looked at him, not as a person, not even as property, but as an object, a tool to be used and manipulated for their purposes. They spoke about him in his presence as if he couldn't understand, discussing his body, his actions, his very essence, as if he were no more conscious than a plough or a hammer. "His energy is strong tonight," Margaret might say, examining him like a horse she was considering purchasing. "The ritual will be more effective. Should we have him fast for another day?" Catherine would ask, her voice clinical and detached. "The book says purification enhances the connection." And Eleanor, sweet Eleanor, who sometimes looked at him with what might have been sympathy, would nod along with whatever the others decided, her own desperation overriding any impulse toward compassion. Samuel had tried, in the early years, to maintain some sense of his own identity. He would whisper his real name to himself in the darkness of whatever room they had assigned him for the night. He would remember stories his mother had told him, songs his father had sung, the feeling of running free through the woods near his childhood home. But gradually, relentlessly, the sisters had worn away at those memories, replacing them with their own twisted narrative of who and what he was supposed to be. They gave him new names based on their rituals: vessel during certain ceremonies, conduit when they needed him to handle their mystical objects, instrument when they discussed their plans for him. The physical violations had been the hardest to endure. They had required him to submit to examinations of his body, claiming they needed to understand his spiritual energy. They had drawn his blood for their rituals, carved symbols into his skin that they said would enhance his power, forced him to consume concoctions that left him sick and disoriented for days. But perhaps the cruelest violation had been the way they had tried to control his thoughts and emotions. They punished him not just for disobedience, but for any sign that he retained his own will, his own desires, his own sense of self. They wanted him to want what they wanted, to believe in their obsessions as fervently as they did. "You understand, don't you, Samuel?" Margaret would say after particularly intense ritual sessions. "You understand that we're trying to create something beautiful, something sacred? You want to help us, don't you?" And Samuel, exhausted and broken, would nod and say yes, because saying no would only bring more pain, more punishment, more attempts to break down the walls he had built around his inner self. But tonight, as he carried the dinner tray toward the parlor, where the sisters were conducting their nightly planning session, Samuel felt something different stirring within him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, the sharp, clean sensation of moral clarity. He had heard enough of their whispered conversations to understand what they were planning. They wanted him to violate innocent families, to steal from children who had done nothing wrong, to become complicit in an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he approached the parlor door, Samuel could hear their voices more clearly. "The Henderson house will be the easiest," Margaret was saying. "They leave the nursery window cracked open for air. Samuel can slip in and out without anyone knowing." "What if the baby wakes up?" Catherine asked nervously. "Babies sleep deeply," Eleanor replied, though her voice lacked conviction, "and we only need a small lock of hair. It won't hurt the child." Samuel paused outside the door, the tray heavy in his hands. For 10 years he had listened to these women plan increasingly disturbing rituals, had participated in ceremonies that violated his dignity and his beliefs, had allowed them to use his body and his spirit for their obsessions. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about innocent children, about families who had done nothing to deserve having their homes violated, their babies touched by the madness that had consumed the Whitmore sisters. He thought about his own childhood, about the safety he had felt in his mother's arms, about the way his father had protected their family from the dangers of the world. He thought about how he would have felt if strangers had crept into their home in the darkness, had touched him while he slept, had stolen pieces of him for their own twisted purposes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't do this. Not this. Not to children who had never harmed anyone, who deserved to sleep safely in their beds without fear of the monsters that walked among them. Samuel took a deep breath and pushed open the parlor door. The 3 sisters looked up at him expectantly, their faces flushed with the excitement of their planning. "Ah, Samuel," Margaret said, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to give him instructions for a ritual. "Perfect timing. We need to discuss your task for tomorrow night." Samuel set the tray down on a side table, his movements careful and controlled. When he straightened up, he looked directly at Margaret, meeting her eyes in a way he hadn't done in years. "I won't do it," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. The sisters stared at him in shock, as if he had suddenly begun speaking in tongues. Margaret was the first to recover. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said I won't do it," Samuel repeated, his voice growing stronger. "I won't break into those houses. I won't steal from those children. I won't be part of this." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 10 years of submission and compliance falling away from his shoulders like chains being broken. Margaret stood up slowly, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. "You seem to have forgotten your place," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You seem to have forgotten what you are, what you owe us, what we can do to you if you displease us." Samuel felt a tremor of the old fear, the conditioned response to her threats that had kept him compliant for so long. But underneath that fear was something stronger, a sense of rightness, of finally standing up for something that mattered more than his own survival. "I haven't forgotten anything," he said. "I remember exactly what I am, what you've made me, what you've taken from me. But I also remember what I was before you broke me down, and I remember that some things are more important than avoiding punishment." Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if Samuel had struck her. Eleanor had gone pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something that might have been admiration. But Margaret's reaction was the most frightening of all. Her face had gone completely blank, her eyes taking on the flat, emotionless stare of someone whose grip on reality had finally snapped. "You will do as you are told," she said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that was more terrifying than any scream. "You will do as you are told, because that is what you were made for. That is your purpose. That is your only purpose." She began walking toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. "You belong to us," she continued, her voice rising with each word. Your body belongs to us, your will belongs to us, your very soul belongs to us. You have no right to refuse, no right to choose, no right to think for yourself. Samuel stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run, to submit, to fall back into the familiar pattern of compliance that had kept him alive for so long. No, he said simply. Not this time. Not for this. The words seemed to hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stopped walking, swaying slightly on her feet, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Catherine began to cry, soft, frightened sobs that filled the silence. Eleanor was staring at Samuel with an expression he couldn't quite read, part terror, part something that looked almost like relief. You don't understand, Eleanor said suddenly, her voice breaking. We need this so badly. We've tried everything else. We've sacrificed everything else. This is our last chance. Samuel looked at her, seeing for the first time in years not the obsessed woman who had helped torment him, but the broken, desperate person underneath. I understand, he said gently. I understand that you're in pain, that you want something you can't have, that you're willing to do terrible things to get it. But understanding doesn't mean I have to help you hurt innocent people. Innocent people, Margaret repeated, her voice dripping with venom. Innocent people who have everything we've been denied. Innocent people who sleep peacefully while we suffer. Innocent people who take their blessings for granted while we beg for scraps. She was moving toward him again, her hands clenched into fists, her face twisted with years of accumulated rage and disappointment. You will do this, she hissed. You will do this because I command it, because we own you, because you have no choice in the matter. Samuel shook his head slowly. You can own my body, he said. You can punish me, torture me, even kill me. But you can't own my choices. You can't make me violate innocent children. You can't force me to become the monster you want me to be. The words seemed to break something fundamental in Margaret's mind. She let out a sound that was part scream, part sob, part animal howl of rage and despair. Then you are useless to us, she said, her voice now completely flat and emotionless. If you won't serve our purpose, then you serve no purpose at all. She turned to her sisters, her movements sharp and decisive. He has betrayed us. After everything we've done for him, everything we've given him, he has chosen to betray us in our moment of greatest need. Catherine was still crying, but her sobs had taken on a note of hysteria. Eleanor was backing toward the door, her face pale with dawning horror. Margaret, Eleanor said, her voice shaking, what are you saying? What are you thinking of doing? Margaret's smile was the most terrifying thing Samuel had ever seen, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of sanity. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that if our instrument is broken, we need to find a new one. And if our sisters lack the commitment to see this through. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Samuel realized with crystal clarity that he had just set in motion events that would end in blood. By refusing to violate innocent children, he had forced Margaret to confront the true depths of her madness, and that confrontation was going to destroy everyone in its path. But even knowing what was coming, even understanding the price he would pay for his defiance, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. He felt proud of himself. For the first time since he had been dragged away from his family and sold into slavery, Samuel had made a choice based not on survival or compliance, but on what was right. And whatever happened next, no one could take that away from him. The storm was coming, and Samuel stood at its center, finally free. The parlor had become a battlefield where the last remnants of sanity warred against the consuming darkness of obsession. Margaret stood in the center of the room like a general surveying a mutiny, her eyes moving between Samuel's defiant face and her sister's growing horror with the cold calculation of someone who had crossed the final line between reason and madness. Eleanor was the first to break the terrible silence that had settled over them like a shroud. "Margaret, please," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of dawning realization. "Listen to yourself. Listen to what you're saying. This isn't who we are. This isn't who we were meant to become." But Margaret's attention had shifted away from Samuel entirely, focusing instead on Eleanor with the intensity of a predator, identifying its prey. Who we were meant to become, Margaret repeated, her voice taking on that sing-song quality that had become more pronounced as her grip on reality loosened. And who exactly were we meant to become, Eleanor? Barren women? Failures? Objects of pity and whispered gossip? She began pacing again, her movements sharp and erratic, like a caged animal that had finally decided to turn on its captors. We were meant to be mothers, she continued, her voice rising with each word. We were meant to hold babies in our arms, to feel life growing within us, to fulfill the most basic purpose that God gave to women. But instead, we've been cursed, abandoned, left to wither away in this house while other women live the lives that should have been ours. Catherine had stopped crying, but her face remained streaked with tears as she watched her sister with growing alarm. Margaret, you're frightening me. This isn't like you. You've always been the strong one, the one who held us together. Margaret whirled on her, her eyes blazing with fanatic fervor. Held us together? I've been the only one with the courage to do what needed to be done. I've been the only one willing to make the sacrifices necessary to break our curse. And now, when we're finally on the verge of success, you want to abandon everything because of misplaced sympathy for strangers? Samuel watched this exchange with a mixture of fascination and horror. For 10 years he had seen these women as a unified force of oppression, 3 minds working in concert to torment him. But now, faced with his refusal to participate in their most heinous plan, the cracks in their alliance were becoming chasms. Eleanor took a step toward Margaret, her hands extended in a gesture of pleading. Sister, please. Can't you see what we've become? Can't you see how far we've fallen from the women we once were? We used to go to church. We used to care about our neighbors. We used to believe in goodness and mercy. Goodness and mercy, Margaret spat. Where was God's goodness when our husbands died? Where was His mercy when month after month, year after year, our wombs remained empty? Where was the kindness of our neighbors when they whispered about us behind their hands, when they excluded us from their gatherings, when they looked at us with pity and disgust? She was working herself into a frenzy now, her voice echoing off the walls of the parlor, her hands gesturing wildly as years of suppressed rage poured out of her like poison from a lanced wound. I have spent 10 years searching for a solution, she continued. 10 years studying, learning, trying every ritual, every ceremony, every possible way to break the curse that has destroyed our lives. And now, when I've finally found the answer, when I've finally discovered what we need to do, you want to abandon it all because of squeamishness? Eleanor was crying now, but her tears were different from Catherine's. Not tears of fear, but tears of grief for what they had all lost, not just in terms of children, but in terms of their own humanity. Margaret, listen to yourself, she pleaded. You're talking about stealing from babies. You're talking about violating innocent families. You're talking about forcing Samuel to commit crimes that could get him killed. How is any of that going to bring us the peace we're looking for? But Margaret was beyond reason now, beyond any appeal to morality or compassion. The mention of Samuel's potential fate seemed to trigger something even darker in her already fractured psyche. Samuel, she said, turning to look at him with eyes that held no trace of human warmth. Our faithful instrument who has suddenly developed a conscience, our obedient servant who has decided that his moral qualms are more important than our desperate need. She walked toward him slowly, her movements predatory and deliberate. Samuel stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run. Do you know what I think, Samuel? She continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I think you've been planning this betrayal for a long time. I think you've been waiting for the perfect moment to destroy us, to deny us the one thing we want most in this world. That's not true, Samuel said quietly. I've served you faithfully for 10 years. I've endured everything you've asked of me, participated in every ritual, submitted to every humiliation. But I won't hurt innocent children. I won't cross that line. Margaret's laugh was like breaking glass. Innocent children. As if you care about innocence. As if a man like you understands anything about purity or virtue. The racial slur that followed hit Samuel like a physical blow, not because he hadn't heard such words before, but because it revealed the true depth of Margaret's hatred, not just for him but for everything and everyone that stood between her and her obsession. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Even Catherine, who had remained largely silent, looked appalled at her sister's words. "Margaret," Eleanor exclaimed, "how can you say such things? How can you speak with such hatred about someone who has served us faithfully for so long?" But Margaret was beyond shame now, beyond any pretense of civility or human decency. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the monster that obsession and desperation had created. "Served us faithfully?" she repeated mockingly. "He has served us because he had no choice. He has participated in our rituals because the alternative was punishment. And now when we need him most, he reveals his true nature, selfish, disobedient, ungrateful." She was standing directly in front of Samuel now, her face inches from his, her breath hot against his skin. "But I understand now," she continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more frightening than her earlier rage. "I understand that we've been approaching this all wrong. We've been trying to use a broken instrument, a flawed tool. We've been placing our faith in someone who was never worthy of our trust." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He could see in Margaret's eyes that she had moved beyond anger, beyond disappointment, into a realm of cold calculation that was far more dangerous. "What are you saying, Margaret?" Catherine asked, her voice barely audible. Margaret turned to face her sisters, her expression serene in a way that was absolutely terrifying. "I'm saying that we need to reconsider our approach," she said calmly. "I'm saying that perhaps we've been too dependent on external help, too willing to place our fate in the hands of others. Perhaps it's time we took matters into our own hands." Eleanor was backing toward the door now, her face pale with understanding. "Margaret, no. Whatever you're thinking, please don't do anything we'll all regret." But Margaret's smile was the expression of someone who had moved beyond regret, beyond consequence, beyond any consideration except the fulfillment of her obsession. "Regret," she repeated softly. "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to see the truth. The only thing I regret is allowing weakness and sentimentality to delay our destiny." She moved to the mantelpiece where she kept some of her most prized mystical artifacts, crystals, carved symbols, and a small silver knife that she claimed had been blessed by practitioners of ancient fertility rites. "We don't need Samuel," she said, picking up the knife and examining its blade in the candlelight. "We don't need anyone who lacks the commitment to do what must be done. We can perform the ritual ourselves." Catherine was on her feet now, her face white with terror. "Margaret, put that down. You're scaring us. You're scaring me." "Good," Margaret replied without looking at her. "Fear is appropriate. Fear means you understand the gravity of our situation, the importance of what we're about to accomplish." Samuel realized that he was witnessing the complete mental breakdown of a woman who had been teetering on the edge of sanity for years. Margaret's obsession had finally consumed the last vestiges of her rational mind, leaving behind something that was no longer entirely human. "Margaret," he said carefully, his voice calm and steady despite the danger he could feel building in the room like pressure before a storm. "You don't want to do this. You don't want to hurt your sisters. They love you. They've stood by you through everything." Margaret's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing with renewed fury. "Don't you dare speak to me about love. Don't you dare pretend to understand what binds us together. You know nothing about love, nothing about loyalty, nothing about the bonds that tie family together." "Then prove it," Samuel said, taking a calculated risk. "Prove that you love them by putting down the knife. Prove that you care about them by not doing something that will destroy all of you." For a moment, Margaret seemed to waver, the knife trembling in her hand, as some small part of her rational mind struggled against the madness that had consumed her. But then Eleanor made a fatal mistake. In her desperation to reach her sister, to pull her back from the brink of irreversible action, she stepped forward and placed her hand on Margaret's arm. "Please, Margaret," she whispered, "please remember who you are. Remember who we are. Remember the women we used to be before all this started." The touch seemed to trigger something explosive in Margaret's fractured psyche. She spun around, the knife flashing in the candlelight, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the three sisters stood frozen in a tableau of horror. "I remember exactly who we used to be," Margaret said, her voice now completely calm and emotionless. "We used to be failures. We used to be disappointments. We used to be women who accepted our fate instead of fighting to change it." The knife moved with shocking speed, and Eleanor's gasp of pain and surprise seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot. Catherine screamed, a sound of pure terror and disbelief that seemed to go on forever. Samuel lunged forward, but he was too far away, too late to prevent what was happening. Eleanor looked down at the spreading red stain on her dress with an expression of profound confusion, as if she couldn't quite understand how it had gotten there. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice already growing weak. "Why?" Margaret's answer was delivered with the cold precision of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Because you were going to betray me. Because you were going to choose them over me. Because you were going to deny me my last chance at motherhood." Eleanor collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed against the wound, her face growing pale as her life flowed out of her onto the parlor floor. Catherine was still screaming, but her screams had taken on a note of hysteria that suggested her mind was beginning to fracture under the weight of what she was witnessing. Samuel found himself frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. In all his years of slavery, in all the cruelty and violence he had witnessed and endured, he had never seen anything as coldly calculated as this moment. Margaret stood over her dying sister with an expression of serene satisfaction, as if she had just completed a difficult but necessary task. "Now," she said, turning to Catherine with the same calm demeanor, "we can proceed without interference. We can do what needs to be done without weak-willed sisters undermining our efforts." Catherine had stopped screaming, but only because she seemed to have lost the ability to make any sound at all. She stared at Margaret with the wide-eyed terror of someone who had just realized she was trapped in a room with a monster. "Margaret," she managed to whisper, "Eleanor is dying. Our sister is dying. We need to help her." Margaret glanced down at Eleanor, who was now lying motionless on the floor, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. "She's already dead," Margaret said matter-of-factly, "and it's better this way. She would have only held us back, filled us with doubt and hesitation when we needed to be strong and decisive." She turned back to Catherine, the knife still in her hand, still stained with Eleanor's blood. "Now it's just you and me," she said with a smile that was somehow more terrifying than any expression of rage. "Just the two of us, working together to achieve our destiny. Isn't that better? Isn't that cleaner?" Catherine was backing away now, her hands held out in front of her in a futile gesture of protection. "Margaret, please," she begged, "please don't hurt me. Please don't do this. I'll help you. I'll do whatever you want, just please don't hurt me." But Margaret was shaking her head, her expression almost pitying. "Oh, Catherine," she said softly. "Sweet, weak Catherine. You still don't understand, do you? You still think this is about what you're willing to do, about what you're willing to sacrifice." She took a step closer, and Catherine stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. "This is about commitment," Margaret continued, advancing on her fallen sister like a predator stalking wounded prey. "This is about being willing to do whatever it takes, to sacrifice whatever is necessary, to pay whatever price is demanded." Catherine was crawling backward now, leaving a trail of tears on the floor as she tried desperately to escape her sister's approach. "I'm committed," she cried. "I've been with you through everything. I've never questioned you, never opposed you, never tried to stop you." "Exactly," Margaret said, her voice taking on that sing-song quality again. "You've never questioned me because you've never truly believed. You followed me because it was easier than thinking for yourself, because it was safer than taking responsibility for your own choices." She was standing over Catherine now, the knife raised above her head, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight in a way that made her look like some ancient goddess of vengeance. "But true commitment requires sacrifice," she continued. "True belief demands that we give up everything that holds us back, everything that keeps us from achieving our destiny." Catherine's scream was cut short by the descending blade, and suddenly the parlor was filled with a silence more complete than death itself. Samuel stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what he had just witnessed. In the space of minutes, Margaret had murdered both of her sisters, had destroyed the only family she had left in the world, all in service of an obsession that had consumed her completely. Margaret straightened up slowly, the knife dripping in her hand, her dress stained with the blood of the women who had stood by her through years of shared suffering and desperate hope. When she turned to look at Samuel, her eyes held no trace of remorse, no hint of recognition of the horror she had just committed. Instead, there was only a terrible satisfaction, the expression of someone who had finally removed all obstacles to achieving her heart's desire. "Now," she said, her voice perfectly calm and rational, as if she were discussing the weather, "we can begin the real work. Now we can do what needs to be done without interference, without weakness, without anyone to hold us back." Samuel realized, with crystalline clarity, that he was now alone in the house with a woman who had crossed every line, broken every taboo, destroyed every relationship in pursuit of her obsession. And that obsession now had only one remaining focus: him. The storm had finally broken, and Samuel stood at its center, the sole survivor of a madness that had consumed everything in its path. But he was not yet free. Not while Margaret still drew breath, not while her obsession still burned in her eyes like hellfire. The final confrontation was coming, and Samuel knew that only one of them would live to see the dawn. The parlor had become a charnel house, the elegant furniture and mystical artifacts now splattered with the blood of Margaret's sisters. The candles continued to flicker, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the two bodies lying on the Persian rug that had once been the pride of the Whitmore household. Margaret stood in the center of the carnage, her dress soaked with blood, her hair disheveled, but her face wearing an expression of serene satisfaction that was more terrifying than any display of rage or grief. She looked at Samuel with the calm attention of someone who had just completed one task and was ready to move on to the next. "You see how simple it was," she said, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining a lesson to a slow student. "All these years, I thought I needed their support, their participation, their belief in our cause, but I was wrong. I was allowing their weakness to contaminate my strength, their doubt to undermine my certainty." Samuel remained frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. He had seen violence before. The casual brutality of slavery had exposed him to beatings, whippings, and worse. But this was different. This was the methodical destruction of family bonds by someone who had once claimed to love the people she had just murdered. "Margaret," he said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "what have you done?" She looked at him with genuine surprise, as if the question itself was incomprehensible. "I've done what needed to be done," she replied matter-of-factly. "I've removed the obstacles that were preventing us from achieving our destiny. I've eliminated the weakness that was holding us back." She began walking toward him, stepping over Eleanor's body without so much as a glance downward, the bloody knife still clutched in her right hand. "Don't you see, Samuel? This is actually better, this is cleaner. Now there's no one to question our methods, no one to introduce doubt or hesitation when we need to be strong and decisive." Samuel felt his back press against the doorframe as she approached. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee this house of madness and never look back. But he also knew that running would only delay the inevitable. Margaret's obsession had found its final focus, and she would pursue him to the ends of the earth rather than allow him to escape. "You're insane," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Margaret paused, tilting her head to one side as if considering his statement with academic interest. "Insane," she repeated thoughtfully. "Is it insane to want what every woman wants? Is it insane to refuse to accept a fate that others have decided for me? Is it insane to be willing to sacrifice everything to achieve my heart's desire?" She was close enough now that he could smell the metallic scent of blood on her clothes, could see the flecks of red that had splattered across her pale cheek. "And what's insane," and she continued, her voice growing harder, "is the way this world treats women who can't fulfill their biological purpose. What's insane is the way society discards us, pities us, treats us as failures because our bodies won't cooperate with our desires." Samuel realized that arguing with her was pointless. Margaret had moved beyond the reach of reason, beyond any appeal to logic or morality. Her obsession had become a complete worldview, a lens through which she interpreted every event, every relationship, every possibility. "What do you want from me?" he asked instead. Margaret's smile was radiant, the expression of someone who had finally been asked the right question. "I want you to help me complete the ritual," she said. "I want you to understand that everything that's happened tonight has been necessary, that every sacrifice has brought us closer to our goal." She gestured toward the bodies of her sisters with casual indifference. "Their blood will make the ceremony more powerful," she explained. "Their sacrifice will demonstrate to the forces we're invoking that we're serious about our commitment, that we're willing to pay any price for what we want." Samuel felt his stomach turn. "You want to use your sister's blood in your ritual?" "Of course," Margaret replied, as if the question itself was absurd. "Blood is life, Samuel. Blood is power. The blood of those who shared my curse, who understood my pain, who were willing to die for our cause. That blood will be the key to breaking the barriers that have kept us from our destiny." She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers leaving red smears on his skin. "And your participation will complete the circle," she continued. "Your willing cooperation will show that you understand the importance of what we're doing, that you're ready to be more than just an instrument. You're ready to be a partner in creation itself." Samuel looked into her eyes and saw no trace of the woman who had once been capable of human emotion, human connection, human love. Margaret had become something else entirely, a creature of pure obsession, a being whose entire existence was focused on a single, impossible goal. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something cold and deadly flickered behind her eyes. "You won't refuse," she said with absolute certainty, "because you understand now that there's no escape from this house, no escape from me, no escape from the destiny that has brought us together." She turned away from him and began moving around the room, gathering items for her ritual: candles, crystals, the leather-bound book that contained her most treasured ceremonies. "You see, Samuel," she continued as she worked, "I've realized something important tonight. I've realized that I don't need your willing cooperation. I don't need you to believe in what we're doing or to understand its importance." She paused in her preparations to look at him directly. "I just need your body. I just need your blood. I just need your essence to complete the ritual. Whether you participate willingly or unwillingly is ultimately irrelevant." The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone she might have used to discuss the weather, but its implications were crystal clear. Samuel was no longer a person in Margaret's eyes. He was simply a component in her final ceremony, a necessary ingredient in the recipe for her salvation. Samuel realized that he was facing a choice that would define not just his survival, but his very soul. He could submit to Margaret's demands, allow himself to be used in whatever horrific ritual she had planned, and hope that somehow he would survive the experience. Or he could resist, knowing that resistance would almost certainly mean death, but also knowing that some things were worth dying for. As he stood there in the doorway of that blood-soaked parlor, surrounded by the evidence of Margaret's complete moral collapse, Samuel thought about the children sleeping peacefully in their beds throughout the county. He thought about their parents, who trusted that their homes were safe, that their babies would wake up unharmed in the morning. He thought about his own childhood, about the mother who had sung him lullabies, and the father who had taught him to carve wood, and the community that had raised him with love and dignity before the slave traders came. And he thought about the man he had been before 10 years of servitude had worn away at his sense of self, before Margaret's rituals had tried to transform him into something less than human. "No," he said quietly. Margaret looked up from her preparations, her eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said no," Samuel repeated, his voice growing stronger. "I won't participate in your ritual. I won't help you desecrate your sisters' bodies. I won't be part of whatever madness you're planning to do." Margaret set down the candle she had been holding and turned to face him fully, her expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been amusement. "Oh, Samuel," she said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You still think you have a choice in this matter. You still believe that your preferences, your moral qualms, your personal feelings have any relevance to what's about to happen." She picked up the bloody knife from where she had set it on the mantelpiece, examining its edge with the casual interest of someone inspecting a tool. "Let me explain something to you," she continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone addressing a child. "You are going to participate in this ritual. You are going to provide what I need from you. The only question is whether you do so as a willing partner or as an unwilling sacrifice." Samuel felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over him, the same crushing sense of powerlessness that had defined his existence for the past 10 years. But underneath that familiar despair, something else was stirring, a flame of defiance that Margaret's cruelty had failed to extinguish. "You can kill me," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "You can torture me, mutilate me, do whatever you want to my body, but you can't make me willing. You can't make me complicit. You can't make me help you." Margaret's smile was the expression of someone who had just heard a particularly amusing joke. "Can't I?" she asked softly. She moved to one of the windows and pulled back the heavy curtain slightly, revealing a view of the slave quarters where other enslaved people lived and worked on the plantation. "Tell me, Samuel," she said, without turning around, "do you remember Josiah, the old man who works in the stables? He must be nearly 70 now, barely able to lift a saddle, but still trying to earn his keep because he knows what happens to slaves who can no longer work." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the window. "And what about Sarah?" Margaret continued. "The young woman who helps in the kitchen? She has a baby, doesn't she? A little girl, maybe 2 years old. Such a sweet child, always laughing and playing in the dirt behind the quarters." She turned back to face him, her eyes glittering with malicious intelligence. "You see, Samuel, you're not the only one whose fate is in my hands. There are others on this plantation, others whose lives depend on my goodwill, my protection, my continued sanity." The threat was clear, and Samuel felt his defiance crumble under the weight of it. Margaret wasn't just threatening him, she was threatening innocent people who had no part in this conflict, no way to protect themselves from her madness. "You wouldn't," he whispered, though even as he said it, he knew he was wrong. A woman who could murder her own sisters in cold blood would have no qualms about harming strangers. "Wouldn't I?" Margaret asked, her voice taking on that sing-song quality again. "After everything you've witnessed tonight, do you really think there's anything I wouldn't do to achieve my goal?" She began walking toward him again, the knife held loosely in her hand, her movements predatory and confident. "So let me ask you again, Samuel," she said. "Will you participate willingly in the ritual that will finally grant me the child I've been denied for so long? Or will I need to demonstrate just how serious I am about removing all obstacles to my destiny?" Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He could resist and watch innocent people suffer for his defiance, or he could submit and become complicit in whatever horror Margaret had planned. But as he stood there in that moment of terrible decision, Samuel realized something that Margaret, in her madness, had failed to understand. She had made a fundamental error in her calculations, a mistake that would prove to be her undoing. She had assumed that breaking his spirit would make him compliant, that threatening others would force him to submit. But instead, her cruelty had done something else entirely. It had reminded him of who he really was, underneath all the years of servitude and degradation. He was Samuel, son of a woodcarver, member of a community that had valued courage and dignity above survival. He was a man who had been taught that some things were worth dying for, that some lines should never be crossed, that protecting the innocent was more important than protecting oneself. When he opened his eyes, Margaret saw something there that made her take an involuntary step backward. "You're right," Samuel said quietly. "There are other people on this plantation whose lives you could destroy. There are innocent people who would suffer if you decided to take your madness out on them." Margaret's smile returned, triumphant and cruel. "Then you understand. But," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger, "there's something you don't understand. Something you've never understood, despite all your years of trying to break me down and build me back up as your instrument." He took a step toward her, and for the first time since he had known her, Margaret Whitmore looked uncertain. "You can threaten me, torture me, kill me," Samuel said. "You can threaten others, hurt them, destroy their lives, but you can't make me into the monster you want me to be. You can't force me to violate innocent children. You can't make me help you commit the kind of evil that would damn my soul for eternity." Margaret raised the knife, her hand trembling slightly. "You will do as I command," she hissed. "You will serve my purpose, or I will make you watch as I destroy everyone you care about." Samuel shook his head slowly. "No, Margaret, I won't, because I finally remembered something that 10 years of slavery almost made me forget." He looked directly into her eyes, and his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I would rather die as a man than live as your instrument. I would rather face whatever punishment you can devise than become the kind of person who hurts children to satisfy someone else's obsession." The words seemed to hit Margaret like physical blows. Her face cycled through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. "You're nothing!" she screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "You're property! You're a tool! You don't get to make moral choices. You don't get to decide what's right or wrong." But even as she screamed, Samuel could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. For the first time in years, Margaret was facing someone who refused to be broken, someone whose will remained intact, despite everything she had done to destroy it. "You're wrong," Samuel said simply. "I'm a man. I'm a human being with a soul and a conscience and the right to choose between good and evil. And I choose to protect the innocent, even if it costs me everything." Margaret let out a sound that was part scream, part sob, part animal howl of rage and despair. She lunged at him with the knife, but her movements were wild and uncontrolled, driven by emotion rather than calculation. Samuel caught her wrist, his years of physical labor giving him strength that her madness couldn't match. They struggled for a moment, the knife wavering between them, their faces inches apart. "You've destroyed everything," Margaret gasped, her voice breaking. "You've ruined everything. You've taken away my last chance, my only hope." "No," Samuel said, his voice gentle despite the violence of their struggle. "You destroyed everything yourself. You chose obsession over love, madness over sanity, evil over good. I didn't take away your chance at happiness. You threw it away when you decided that your desires were more important than other people's lives." The knife clattered to the floor as Margaret's strength finally gave out. She collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. "I just wanted to be a mother," she whispered, her voice broken and childlike. "I just wanted to hold a baby in my arms, to feel complete, to have a purpose. Was that so wrong? Was that so much to ask?" Samuel felt a wave of pity for this broken woman who had once been someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone capable of love and kindness before obsession had consumed her completely. "No," he said softly. "It wasn't wrong to want that. But it was wrong to hurt innocent people in pursuit of it. It was wrong to let your pain turn you into someone who could murder her own sisters." Margaret pulled back to look at him, her face streaked with tears and blood, her eyes holding a clarity they hadn't possessed in years. "What have I done?" she whispered. "Oh God, what have I become?" For a moment, Samuel saw a glimpse of the woman Margaret might have been, if grief and desperation hadn't twisted her into something monstrous. But that moment of clarity was brief, flickering like a candle flame in a strong wind. "It's too late," she said, her voice taking on a note of finality. "It's too late for redemption, too late for forgiveness, too late for anything but the consequences of what I've done." She looked around the parlor at the bodies of her sisters, at the blood-stained furniture, at the evidence of her complete moral collapse. "I can't live with this," she said simply. "I can't live with what I've become, what I've done, what I've destroyed." Samuel understood what she was planning before she moved toward the knife on the floor. "Margaret, don't," he said, reaching for her. "It doesn't have to end this way. You can still choose to do the right thing. You can still find some measure of redemption." But Margaret was shaking her head, her expression serene in a way that was somehow more frightening than her earlier madness. "Some sins are too great for redemption," she said. "Some choices can't be undone. Some people can't be saved from what they've become." She picked up the knife with steady hands, looking at Samuel with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for reminding me that there are still people in this world who choose to do the right thing, even when it costs them everything. Thank you for showing me that not everyone can be broken, Not everyone can be corrupted. Margaret, please, tell them, she interrupted, her voice urgent now. When they find us, when they ask what happened here, tell them the truth. Tell them about the madness that consumed 3 women who couldn't accept their fate. Tell them about the man who refused to become a monster, even when his life depended on it. The knife moved with swift precision, and Margaret Whitmore's long obsession finally came to an end. Samuel stood alone in the parlor, surrounded by the bodies of 3 women who had once been capable of love, laughter, and hope, before grief and desperation had destroyed them. The candles continued to flicker, casting shadows that seemed to dance in celebration of their freedom from the madness that had ruled this house for so long. As dawn broke over the Georgia countryside, Samuel walked out of the Whitmore plantation house for the last time. He had survived 10 years of slavery, had endured rituals designed to break his spirit, had faced down a mad woman who had murdered her own family in pursuit of an impossible dream. But more than that, he had remembered who he was. He had chosen to protect the innocent rather than save himself. He had refused to become the instrument of someone else's evil, even when that refusal seemed certain to cost him everything. The authorities would come soon, drawn by reports of screaming in the night. They would find the bodies, would piece together what had happened, would search for someone to blame. Samuel knew that as an enslaved black man found at the scene of 3 white women's deaths, he would likely face accusations, suspicion, and possibly violence regardless of the truth. But he also knew that he had done the right thing. He had protected innocent children from violation, had refused to participate in evil, had maintained his humanity in the face of unimaginable pressure to abandon it. As he walked down the dusty road that led away from the plantation, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. He felt free. Not free from slavery, not yet, but free from the weight of compromise, free from the burden of complicity, free from the crushing knowledge that he had betrayed his own principles to survive. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to promise new beginnings, fresh starts, the possibility of redemption even in the darkest of circumstances. Behind him, the Whitmore house stood silent and empty, its windows still covered, its rooms still dark, but no longer filled with the madness that had consumed its inhabitants. The obsession that had destroyed 3 women and nearly claimed a 4th victim had finally burned itself out, leaving only ashes and the memory of what happens when grief transforms into something monstrous. Samuel walked toward an uncertain future, but he walked as a free man in the only way that truly mattered. Free in his soul, free in his conscience, free in the knowledge that when faced with the ultimate test of his character, he had chosen to remain human. The story of the 3 lonely widows and the man they tried to break would be told and retold in the years that followed, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, the importance of moral courage, and the truth that some things are indeed worth dying for. But for Samuel, walking down that dusty road in the early morning light, the story was not about the past, but about the future, about the man he had chosen to remain and the life he would build on the foundation of that choice. He was finally, truly free. 23 years later, in a small church in Philadelphia, an elderly black man sat across from a young journalist who had traveled from Georgia to hear his story. Samuel's hair was now gray, his hands weathered by decades of honest labor as a free man, but his eyes still held the clarity of someone who had faced the darkness and emerged with his soul intact. "People always ask me," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of years, but also the strength of conviction, "why I risked everything to protect children I had never met, families I didn't know. They ask me how I found the courage to say no to a woman who held my life in her hands." The journalist leaned forward, his pen poised over his notebook. "The answer is simple," Samuel continued. "I remembered that being human isn't about surviving at any cost. It's about choosing to do the right thing, even when that choice might destroy you. It's about protecting the innocent, even when no one will thank you for it. It's about refusing to become the monster that others want you to be." He paused, looking out the window at the bustling streets of Philadelphia, where free black men and women went about their daily lives without fear of the whip or the auction block. "Margaret Whitmore thought she could break me," could turn me into an instrument of her obsession. But she never understood that the human spirit, once it remembers its own worth, cannot be broken by anyone or anything. The journalist scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture not just the words, but the profound dignity of the man speaking them. "What happened to the plantation?" he asked. Samuel smiled, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away from his face. "It was sold after the war. The new owners tore down the main house and built something new, something filled with light and laughter instead of darkness and obsession. The slave quarters were converted into homes for free families. Children play where once there was only suffering." He stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement, but his spirit still strong. "That's how it should be," he said. "That's how it always should be. Light conquering darkness, love overcoming obsession, humanity triumphing over the forces that would reduce us to something less than what God intended us to be." As the journalist packed up his notes and prepared to leave, Samuel placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "When you write this story," he said, "remember that it's not really about 3 women who lost their way or about the horrors they committed in pursuit of their obsession. It's about the choice we all face every day of our lives, the choice between becoming the people we're meant to be or allowing our pain to transform us into something monstrous. And remember this above all, no matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how hopeless the situation seems, we always have the power to choose who we want to be. That power can never be taken from us, no matter what others might do to our bodies or our circumstances." The journalist nodded, understanding that he had been entrusted with more than just a story. He had been given a testament to the indestructible nature of human dignity and the eternal importance of moral courage. As he walked away from that small church in Philadelphia, he carried with him the words of a man who had faced the ultimate test of his character and emerged victorious. Not because he had survived, but because he had chosen to remain human when everything around him demanded that he become something less. The story of Samuel and the 3 lonely widows would be published in newspapers across the country, becoming a powerful reminder that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are always those who choose light over darkness, love over hatred, and humanity over the forces that would destroy it. And in the years that followed, whenever people spoke of courage, of moral strength, of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most terrible circumstances, they would remember the story of a man who said no when saying yes would have been easier, who chose to protect the innocent when protecting himself would have been safer, and who proved that true freedom comes not from the absence of chains, but from the presence of an unbreakable commitment to doing what is right. If this story of courage, moral strength, and the triumph of human dignity over darkness moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share this powerful tale with others who need to be reminded that even in our darkest moments, we always have the power to choose who we want to be. Hit that notification bell to never miss stories that celebrate the indestructible nature of the human spirit. What did you think of Samuel's choice? Would you have had the courage to do what he did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and together we can keep these important conversations alive.